Maddy Goodall is the Humanist Heritage Co-ordinator with Humanist UK. Since 2019, she's been researching the history and influence of the organisation and its members since its founding in 1896 as the Union of Ethical Societies, and building the Humanist Heritage website to share this little-known heritage. Since the beginning of 2022, the project has been supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, working in partnership with the Conway Hall on doers, dreamers, place makers. Maddy is also Humanist UK's Wikimedian in residence, a term I've just discovered, where she advocates for the improvement and diversification of Wikipedia. Maddy, thank you so much for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thank you.
So, I mentioned in the intro there that the Humanist Heritage Programme has been running for 4 years now. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming the Humanist Heritage Coordinator and how you started working with Humanist UK?
Yeah, sure. Dream job, really. I was, prior to starting on the project, starting with Humanist UK, I was actually working on another heritage project based on a historic railway. So lots of what I was doing was railway history and the social history connected to that, and also the biodiversity of that. So I was education officer on that project for a couple of years before this. And there's lots in common, really, in a strange way. It was all about people, and I developed a much stronger knowledge of railways than I ever thought I would possess. But when I saw this role come up, it really seemed to unite, I suppose, everything that kind of previously interested me or already interested me. So in terms of obviously the history side of things, looking back, having this unifying thread, which in my previous project was railways, but in this project was humanism, and then kind of pulling on some of those strands and uncovering some of that history. And further back than that, my background had been kind of a mix between education and museums, or kind of museum education. So it all kind of came together really within a philosophy that I also obviously very much identified with. So yeah, that's the perfect role for me, really.
Perfect. And what prompted the creation of the Humanist Heritage website? And now 4 years in, what are the primary responsibilities and goals of the campaign?
So the project itself was launched back in 2019. That's when I started with Humanists UK, in advance of the 125th anniversary in 2021. So Humanists UK was founded in 1896, as you said, as the Union of Ethical Societies. And so this project was an opportunity to firstly to look a bit more in depth into the archives. We've got great and very extensive collections at the Bishopsgate Institute, and to share that history with as many people as possible, really. So to develop, first and foremost, the Humanist Heritage website, which we launched in 2021 for the anniversary, and also to do other things that would kind of engage people with the history. So events, talks, things like that. And one of there were a few kind of main aims of the project, really. One of them was really about kind of filling in the gaps in history to a certain extent. There was a kind of idea behind the project, which is that often historically, when people have been motivated to do good things by very firm religious beliefs, that's something that's very much forefronted in the way that we remember them and the way that their biographies are written. But in the case of non-religious people, humanist people, that often gets left out or not really mentioned at all, even though we know that humanists throughout history have done incredible things and profoundly changed the world, from establishing the Open University to the NHS to the UNESCO. All of these things have had humanists very much at the heart of them, and that's something that I think even lots of humanists don't know. So that was something that was very much behind the project. And the other thing was about identifying places of built heritage, visible heritage, and lost heritage, like buildings, for example, that testify to that history that weren't really kind of on the map or on a map anywhere. So the Humanist Heritage website has a map function, which we're always looking to enhance. We recognise that it's much more full in some places than others. And also a timeline feature, so you can have a look at how things have kind of developed over, well, hundreds of years. And that actually leads into the project as it stands now, which is since the beginning of this year, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The project that we're working on is called Doers, Dreamers, Placemakers with Conway Hall, so it's a partnership project. And again, we're looking very much at how the spaces and the communities have been built and created and sustained around humanism, which again, I think is something that sometimes it gets forgotten. I think lots of people think of the history of humanism as something that is incredibly kind of intellectual or academic, or ultimately a history of just ideas, or people reading and writing books and arguing with each other, when actually, although obviously those things are a part of it as a scientific developments and all of those things, actually it's people and people gathering together around kind of common values, and often in order to make changes in the world, that is the kind of real the peopled history of humanism, which we're also trying to kind of bring out with this project.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and I would implore all listeners to definitely check out the website and the map to see if they can find their local landmark to humanism, and if not, as you say, submit one as well. Could you share some of the more intriguing or surprising findings from your research so far?
Yeah, so if anybody has ever heard me talk before, you're probably sick of me saying it, but the women of humanist history are the thing that I would say both kind of intrigued and surprised, maybe not in that order, surprised then intrigued me in the research for the project. So when I started the project, through no kind of malice or fault of anyone's own, lots and lots of the names that we had that were, commonly associated with the history of humanism and the organisational history as well, were men, and they were often philosophers and, very academic men. And those people have played a huge part, undoubtedly, in the history of humanism. But one of the things that really fascinated me, and especially when we started looking in the archives, looking at the early minute books, looking at the early membership lists as well of some of the ethical societies who were the early humanist groups, was just how many women were involved, and how they were really kind of the lifeblood of the organisation, doing not just the kind of organising and the running of things, but also being involved very prominently in lots of these other major social causes. So people like Zona Valence, who I've talked about quite a lot in various places, Nellie Freeman, Lily Boileau, May Seaton Tiedman, who was a divorce law reform campaigner, did amazing work in that, alongside much more famous people like Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, but who haven't particularly been remembered for any of that work, for the work within organised humanism, but also for their kind of wider activism and kind of involvement in those other causes. So that's something that has kind of obsessed me ever since the beginning, is trying to uncover a bit more about those and just make them known, because I think they are inspiring, to us now, however different their lives might have been.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the diversification of voices and influences is also just as important as well, as you say, to show the many. We talk often on the podcast about the many roots of humanism and the many different inspirations that have led us to where we are, and it's often a very linear story that is told. And I think you're helping uncover much more of the, as you say, the different voices and the different contributors that have got us to this point.
Yeah, again, I hope so. And I completely recognise there are, I guess, well, limitations on what I'm doing as well. The project is quite focused on UK history, which can risk losing lots of voices from outside who in many cases did have a huge influence on the UK, but also aren't obviously the only interesting stories that there are. So we have tried to make sure that much more global history is represented. As much as anything else, it's just really fascinating to see how those different kind of manifestations have happened over time, not just to build that sense that, this is a philosophy, a way of looking at the world that has always been there, and been there in all cultures, all countries, but in different ways and in really interestingly different ways. And that informs, as you say, how we understand humanism now, and also how it's relevant around the world and what's going on in all of these different places now. So
yeah, the fact that it's had it's sprung up independently in many different areas gives it lots of different sources to draw from. But within the UK, within the research that you've done, I'm wondering, probably a two-part question here. How has the philosophy and practices of humanism evolved in the 125 years since the founding of the Union of Ethical Societies? And then sort of concurrently, how do you feel that the work of organisations like Humanist UK has influenced social attitudes over that period? Sorry to ask you to summarise 125 years in one answer.
128 now. No, but it is a really good question, because things have changed. There's kind of in some ways really remarkable continuity over the last, nearly 130 years now. And then in some ways there have been some key changes. Definitely, in the 1890s context, where they were forming ethical societies, which were consciously not describing themselves as atheist, or even necessarily, well, agnostic more so maybe, but they certainly weren't kind of branding themselves as hardline atheists. And I think, and again, I've definitely said this elsewhere, but I do feel like that the calling themselves ethical societies was a conscious thing. At that point, it was still not very societally acceptable to be a non-religious person, and so making that focus on ethics, and about an ethics that didn't rely on a supernatural idea or a belief in a life after death or anything like that was significant, and I think it was important to how they started out. But it does mean that in some of those early ethical societies, it can be a bit unclear. So, for example, you've got these strange, well, perhaps strange to us now, kind of experiments like the Ethical Church in Bayswater, which came out of the West London Ethical Society, where they were experimenting with, ethical religion and ethical services, where they were secular in the sense that they were not worshipping any god, but they were using language that was, historically very religious, and they were singing hymns, but they were secular hymns, and they were, having services, but they were, and that's something that I think most humanists now probably wouldn't be that drawn to. But it was all part of that kind of early figuring out, what an ethical society should do. And even at that stage, early 1900s, by no means all other ethical societies thought that was a good idea. There has always been, a diversity of opinion and different ideas about whether we want to sing songs, whether we want to, have lectures or discussions, or, what those things should look like. So that's been a change. And there was a very conscious kind of reinvigoration of what it meant to be a humanist organisation in the kind of middle of the 20th century, so 1950s, 1960s, when the word humanist to describe themselves was really taken up and taken on. You had things like Hector Horton's Humanist Revolution, and just this idea that humanism was this life stance, this worldview, which could be a full philosophy, a lived philosophy, and a way of understanding things and defining yourself as a person and within groups. So that has, that's changed definitely, and that I suppose that very conscious identification with the kind of atheist, agnostic, that kind of thing has shifted. Yeah, and I think so I should mention here actually the book, The Humanist Movement, that was written by 3 history professors, David Nash, Callum Brown and Charlie Lynch, which came out, I think, last year, just at the end of last year. And that really tracks this change very consciously over 120 plus years, including the kind of, rising and dipping fortunes of the organisation as well in terms of membership and things like that. Again, for all sorts of reasons, sometimes galvanising around particular causes, and how that's shifted as well. And then I would say, sorry, no, carry on.
No, I was going to say it is interesting how it comes in. It does tend to go in waves. You do have these waves of interest. There was obviously the big surge around sort of early 2000s with the Four Horsemen books that came out, and then the bus campaign was around that time as well. And it does tend to coincide with interest in more publications, but also I think perhaps depending on what the major themes in the news are and around the world. So it's interesting how it does have those peaks as well as troughs.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can kind of, as you say, sometimes map those onto particular things that happen. So, the 60s was an incredibly powerful or very active time as an organisation and as humanists, because there were all of these causes to be fought for. So, abortion law reform, divorce law reform, things like that, and changes that were made, reforms that did happen in law, and shifts in society. And I suppose that leads on to that idea about how Humanist UK has influenced kind of attitudes and policies over the last 125 plus years, which I would say is in so many ways, in kind of every way, in some senses. And again, the book, The Humanist Movement, really lays this out and kind of tracks it, particularly in the kind of, I suppose, the liberalising of ideas around things that historically maybe had been seen as something that was taboo, or that were just very much in control or overly influenced by religious ideas. So things like sex and sexuality, marriage and divorce, reproductive rights, those things. In many cases, the reforms that were being fought for by humanists, it has been decades, if not, over a century of campaigning. And those things, really did profoundly shift, not just the laws, but also public attitudes around it. And sometimes that has been a case of just bringing those things into kind of public discussion. So I don't know, somebody like Margaret Knight, whose birthday it is today as we record, in fact, the 23rd of November. She gave this series of talks on the radio in 1955, Morals Without Religion, caused this massive stir where everyone was horrified at the idea that you might be able to separate education from religion, and that maybe we should be rooting our teaching of morals in something that was a bit firmer and that could be agreed on a bit more widely than religious values. But she also got a huge amount of support for it, and it kind of propelled that discussion into the public forum, really. And I think that's the case with lots of things and lots of these causes, that sometimes it takes, someone or an organisation who are willing to kind of, well, maybe poke the hornet's nest, or just, ask those questions and be open about it.
It's normalizing these ideas, isn't it? So they become more part of the public debate, and that can take many decades of just, you say, they may start out as very taboo, but eventually, I think obvious comparison is with the gay rights movement. And I think just by more and more people identifying, coming out, talking about, humanizing, presenting themselves and being humanized, and being open and not forcing the discussion, but inviting people to participate in the discussion. It then becomes, you break down the taboo, and then it becomes much easier to convince people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as well, I mean, in the example of something like the decriminalisation of homosexuality, the Ethical Union, as Humanists UK was at that stage, gave some of the kind of least equivocal evidence in terms of, suggesting that it should be decriminalised. And I think so. Those things, there are these very clear pieces of evidence from an organisational perspective that these changes have been, supported and kind of pushed for. And I feel like it makes sense, really, for throughout history for two reasons. One, that if I suppose you've been willing at some stage to kind of take a step back from perhaps traditional ideas about religion, then maybe that does incline you more towards being willing also to question some of those other things that are kind of taken for granted or taken uncritically or as fact by other people. Causes that have been kind of championed throughout history is that it's kind of, when you are fundamentally arguing from a kind of standpoint of, or not necessarily arguing, but coming from a standpoint which is rooted in reason and empathy or compassion, it makes sense to me that some of those things that historically and now not criticize or not agree with, that actually historically humanists have said, well, actually maybe we should be reconsidering this because of this piece of evidence, or because of what this person is telling us, or this community is telling us, or because it's the kind thing to do. So yeah, I think kind of makes
yeah. And you and your colleagues at Humanist UK continue to do that great work. I think thinking particularly about the campaign around assisted dying, is very much an evidence-based and empathy-based kind campaign, but it still remains for some people just an absolute taboo. And I feel we still have many years ahead. Looking ahead, I wonder, from your work reflecting on the last 100 plus years, what do you see as the biggest sort of emerging trends or challenges for humanist secularist movements globally, not just in the UK?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, and a hard one, I suppose. I would say, for one thing, and maybe again thinking about it in that historical context, is defending some of the rights that we have won, not just as humanists, but as human beings. So I'm thinking particularly of things around, for example, reproductive rights, when we've seen in the cases of other countries, and this country too, how those things that kind of seem secure can be stripped away. And I know from speaking to people like Diane Munday, who's been a tireless campaigner for abortion rights for, again, decades, said that to me when I spoke to her a few years ago, that it seemed for many people like once the Abortion Act of 1967 came in, it was a kind of, a done deal, a one thing. But actually what people don't see is then how fiercely that has had to be defended ever since, and even in the years immediately following. I suppose as well, just the general human challenges of that we're faced with now. I mean, things like climate change, for example, and we of course have groups like Humanist Climate Action. But that idea of how do we provide a humanist voice where it's needed? How can we be confronting these things as individual humanists and as an organisation, or as individual groups? these things that really do demand, our attention. And also, of course, kind of particularly organisationally, making calls on those things. Where can we really make a difference? So, for example, with Humanists UK and Humanist International as well, thinking about, the global situation. How can we help humanists at risk internationally, for example? Depending, again, acknowledging the very different context that humanists around the world face. I think those are kind of...
Yeah, it's far more interconnected, and the issues now are much more global, I guess, than national. And I think that's probably, looking ahead to the next 125 years, where we'll see that the greatest change. On a positive note, what are your hopes and visions for the future of the organisation, and particularly for the Heritage Project?
So naturally, I hope for success in all our campaigns, and I, of course, believe that it's possible. I think, things like actually getting a ban on so-called conversion therapy, for example, is a big thing that we're still campaigning on, and that I think hopefully we'll see happen. Legal recognition of humanist marriages, as you mentioned earlier, reform around the laws covering assisted dying. Again, that's something that has been, as you pointed out, something that has been being campaigned on for a long, long time. I wrote an article actually for the Humanist Heritage website not that long ago about the history of humanist advocacy for that. And again, that's one of those themes that...
has it actually been around much longer than people would expect?
Yes, yeah. And again, from that, and you use the example, that idea of, if you're arguing something from the standpoint of reason, of evidence, and of empathy, and compassion for other people, then it makes sense that, humanists throughout history might have reached the same conclusions about the need for reform. But actually seeing it, laid out, seeing these different interventions that have been made in the courts and before in literature, again, in bringing it into public debate, all of those things, I think, is so, it's very enlightening to see. And although, sometimes you think, oh, wow, we've really been campaigning for this for a long time, maybe it will never happen. Actually, I think, again, the history does prove that sometimes these things are a long, long time coming, and then it happens very quickly when it does. So, something like blasphemy laws, that was something that from the very beginnings of Humanists UK and before, blasphemy laws were something that were being campaigned against. And now, with the exception of Northern Ireland, we don't have them. So that's another thing. It would be nice to see the abolition of blasphemy laws in Northern Ireland.
It's very true, isn't it, actually, that these campaigns can take decades and decades, and then the norms can flip incredibly quickly in society. And sometimes the law is a little bit ahead or a little bit behind, but it can feel very, very quick once you kind of get enough of the population to kind of at least hear the arguments and accept that this is not an outrageous or a taboo thing to support.
Yeah, absolutely. And just acknowledge that actually lots and lots of people, and often lots and lots more people that are maybe being acknowledged by the people legislating on these things, acknowledge are actually in support of those things, as is the case with assisted dying, and across people of different, faiths and beliefs as well. So, absolutely. As you say, I think that's why it does feel like, there is hope for these things.
And finally, how are you engaging with the public? And I guess if anybody would like to know more, what's the best way for them to follow your work and get involved?
Yeah, so as I say, now we're in this National Lottery Heritage funded phase of the project. And one of the big things that we're doing and we'll be launching in the new year is this interactive virtual tour of Conway Hall. That's something that we're really excited about, that again builds on that idea of the importance of space and community. And Conway Hall is one of only 2 surviving buildings in the UK built by and for the non-religious, which is why we focused on it in this case. And it contains a huge number of kind of stories and things to learn that relate to both the history of humanism and also humanism now and today. So that is something to look out for. Of course, I would plug the Humanist Heritage website. Please do check it out. And of course, I would always implore people to get in touch with me if they think there are things missing. I'm always, of course, acutely aware of all the things that could be on there. But in terms of, just engaging with people and getting people's ideas, there's a huge amount of knowledge within the wider humanist community about everything, but heritage being one, particularly kind of in people's local areas and their kind of own stories and histories and things. And I always love to hear that. Looking forward to next year, we're focusing very much on what will be the 45th anniversary of LGBT humanists, who were founded in 1979 as the Gay Humanist Group. So it's their 45th anniversary next year. We're hoping to do lots around that, including various events. We hope to gather some oral histories as well, to generally produce a lot more kind of research and sharing around that history, which again is a really incredible and rich one. So look out for Humanist Heritage events next year, and of course social media.
As always. Well, speaking of Humanist Heritage events, we're delighted that Maddy will be our keynote speaker at the Central London Humanist AGM on the 17th of January. So we'll include all the details to that. And we're very much looking forward to finding out more about not just the project, but also specifically London's Humanist Heritage, as mentioned, Conway Hall and other tributes to humanism in London. Maddy, thank you so much for your time. Just before we go, our usual wrap-up question. What's something that you've changed your mind on recently, either in relation to the Humanist Heritage Project or just generally?
Oh, that's a hard one. I feel like I should be saying something very profound here, but actually the first thing that occurs to me is that I've recently changed my mind on an antique shop that's near me, which I always used to ignore because nothing had prices on and it was small and I was scared it was going to be super expensive. And then the other day I went in and turns out it was great and it was really cheap, the stuff I wanted, and the guy's really nice. And so now I've been there about 4 times since. And who knows, just goes to show, if you keep an open mind, you might find an antique shop is way better than you thought it was. So
you can discover something completely new that's been on your doorstep the whole time.
Exactly.
I like that attitude. Maddy Goodall, thank you so much for joining us on Humanism Now.
Thanks very much.